of a review of what we have done so far, this was a very important period. This is the beginning of the role of the bishop as we know them now, as part of what people call the hierarchical institution. So we had the episcopoi, the presbyteroi, the diaconoi, and they were doing either teaching or they were doing instruction for catechesis. Teaching there would be much more official teaching on the part of the bishops and the part of the theologians. Instruction will be much more on the level of those who are beginning or just coming into the Christian faith, as well as some other ministries like prayer, visitation, pastoral care, and of course the charismatic, the prophetic ministry, as well as the ministry of the martyrs and the confessors, those who were regarded highly by the people, by the community, because precisely they have witnessed, they've given witness with their lives, especially for the martyrs, given witness with their lives for the faith. But we need to understand that behind all this ministry is a perspective on what the church is. In other words, an ecclesiological perspective. And that is, already the beginning of a hierarchical structure of the church. We're beginning to see the hierarchically centered church, because now we're talking here about the bishop and eventually, of course, the Pope a little bit later. But still, very early, from the time of Paul or from the time of the second or third generation after Paul, the sense of being a community, having a say on who becomes bishop was still very strong. In other words, they were the ones who were choosing who would be a bishop. Of course, nowadays, that's not what's happening. So at that time, the people still had a choice of bishops. The only area where they would not have a choice would be the charismatic part, because they would not be the ones to choose who has the charism or who has not. Eventually, charisms just pop up, and they do a service and ministry to the people. Okay, so behind also this ecclesiological perspective is the idea or interpretation of what kind of ministry and what is the reason for this ministry. So the preeminence of the bishop, for example, was precisely because there was a need to have someone who would be a symbol of the unity of the community, unity of the body of Christ. We have to remember that the church was spreading all through different places during this time. So in spreading, of course, you get the tendency is to be scattered, but you need something or someone to pull you together to become the uniting center that would be looked upon, honestly by the people as the leader, and that fell to the lot of the bishop. But the teachers were also very highly regarded, even catechists like Origen. These are all very, very big. These are big catechists, but they have become theologians and fathers of the church. Now there are also some deacons, but deacons are always been people who were assisting either the bishop or assisting the community, especially in the matter of pastoral service. And then, of course, in regard to the charismatic part, of course, they were sometimes at odds with the bishops, but the community always recognized the validity or legitimacy of charisms in the church, because they've always been part of the experience of the church. At the same time, the role of the bishop as the head, as the center of unity, to regulate the exercise of the charisms. So that was the previous section. Now we're going to talk about priesthood as ministry, how we are going to move from the ministry of the bishop to the ministry of the priest. Now, priest here will have to be taken in two senses. The original idea being the presbyter, which was connected with the bishop. So the number one priest in the diocese of course, was still the bishop. That remains the same up to now. But the other idea of priest is now when they become more and more as cultic leaders. That is a time when the word priest became used rather than presbyter. But this is what we're going to see in this in this chapter. Where is my okay? What is the context, historical context? And as I have told you at the beginning, in presenting this, we have the historical context, then we have the ecclesiological framework, the matter of the church, and then talk about ministry, where exactly ministries fit into the ecclesiological framework. So from the point of view of history, this was the Constantinian era. The Emperor Constantine was very influential, not only all throughout the Roman Empire, but also in the church. In fact, Constantine was the one who convoked the Council of Nicaea in 325. His authority as an emperor, but also recognized as someone who can order the church to do something, not only on behalf of the church, but since majority now of the people in the Roman Empire were Christians, then, or a good part of the members of the Roman Empire or the citizens of the Roman Empire were Christians, then therefore the emperor had felt he had the authority to order the bishops to come together and resolve the particular issue, especially Arianism. It was also the end of the persecution of Christians. So no longer martyrs. Now you become a church now that is part of the what we will call ordinary course of organizations in the Roman Empire. So this was a period where the Roman Empire was in a way Christianized, but the other side of the coin, of course, is that the church had been imperialized. In other words, the church became under the authority of the emperor. And depending on how strong the emperor is, then you would feel how strong the power of the empire of the emperor over of the church. If the pope is stronger than the emperor, then the other thing takes place. It's the church that would dominate and almost would dictate to the Roman Empire. And there were cases of emperors, Roman emperors, who were really, really rather poor leaders. Nagkataon lang at that there were also some very strong leaders on the part of the church, popes, for example, who eventually were the ones who guided both the church and the empire. So, but the dioceses, because of this, have become coterminous with state boundaries. So you have, for example, just different provinces of the Roman Empire. That was the most logical way of organizing the church according to the state boundaries, the state territories. So that was how the dioceses came to be organized. If we are to organize it in that way, here in Manila, in Metro Manila, for example, then we're talking about the National Capital Region would be only one archdiocese, as it used to be in the past. But now it had been subdivided into different dioceses under the metropolitan of the Archdiocese of Manila. Okay, but before, if there's a kind of a union between state and church, then whoever is the Archbishop of Manila will also be the leader of the whole area of, let's say, the country of Metro Manila or the National Capital Region would also be, that would be, sakop niya. That's the territory that he is in charge of. Okay, so church leaders like popes and bishops were both church and political leaders. So I said there's an advantage to being recognized by the empire, but there's also disadvantage because then there will be always conflict, especially among strong-willed leaders. So in the 4th century, in 325 especially, the Council of Nicaea was convoked, and it was to solve precisely the issue of Arianism, the idea of people who did not believe in the divinity of Christ himself. So In fact, the Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to resolve this issue because it was breaking up his own empire. The East and the West are beginning to fight among themselves. And even within the East, for example, or within the West, there were also factions that were in favor of one side and in favor of the other side. So the church also, because became part of the empire, became prominent and rich. Martyrdom gave way to asceticism or to mysticism. In other words, when you no longer have martyrs, there's no longer a need to speak in terms of following Christ closely, being true disciples of Jesus. And the martyrs have given them the examples of what it means to be true disciples and followers of Jesus. So without that, without the threat of being martyred for the faith, how are they going to appreciate their own faith now? We have to remember that it is now the faith of the majority. So when you have the faith of the majority, a good number of people will not be intensely devout in their own faith. As here in the Philippines, we are 80% Catholic. How many of the 80% Catholic are really what we would call practicing Catholics? We will be lucky if we have 15 to 20% of these 80% would be devout. If everybody would be devout or would be intense Catholics, we will not have enough room in churches. We will have to keep building churches, more and more churches. Even now, all our churches are filled, and we can only say 25%, 20 to 25% of the population are what we would call Sunday Christians, and they go to church on Sundays. There are many others who do not go to church on Sunday. Okay. Now, again, unavoidably, patronage will be rampant. Patronage on the part of the empire or the emperor or the nobilities, okay? Because, again, humanly speaking, there is something to be gained by being a patron of the church, for example. If you're a patron of a certain diocese, you give, a donation to the diocese. Of course, at the very least, you have a special place in the church. Or another time, you maybe have a greater say on who becomes a bishop. Who knows? You're a benefactor. Okay, so patronage is not something new. It's happening now. It happened in the past. Can you imagine if you have the emperor as the patron? You can just imagine what is going to be to happen. Properties and properties galore will be given to you, to the church. Oh, for the benefit of the church. And that is what's happening actually in different areas, mission areas. That is what people do to the church. Oh, we will donate to you several hectares of property. You can build a church here. Of course, they have something to gain there. What? Schools will come, health clinics will come, and maybe the seat of the municipality will be nearby. If you go to Bicol, for example, in every town there, you have the church facing the municipio, and then of course on the other side would be the basketball court, or a tennis court where there is people playing, or which is also used for gatherings. So that is the arrangement. So patronage is important. It's helpful, but it can also be very, very controlling. All right. Now, it is at this period when we would speak about sacerdotalization or clericalization of ministry. Of course, we say bishops were also presbyters and priests in their own right several centuries ago. But at this time, it seems like ministry now is going to be focused on those who are called priests, sacerdotes, or clerics. Okay, bishops continued to be the undisputed heads of the church because they combine the roles of teachers, prophets, and liturgical leader. At the onset of this era, the community chose the bishops, but later, the choice was made by presbyters, in other words, the council of elders, or by the bishops of the region. So the bishops of the region are now being consulted who becomes a bishop. But the people just generally approved the choice. The people are still involved in the choice of the bishop, even if it is a minimal participation in the process. Now, bishops at this time exercised ecclesiastical and civil roles, thus strengthening the monarchical elements of the hierarchy. So when you talk about the marriage, the union between state and church, this is not yet the high point would be coming towards the Middle Ages. But when you put these two together under one person, you are a civil ruler, at the same time you are the church leader, then there's bound to be some good coming out of it, but also some great difficulties and conflicts. Before, in the 1600s, when the Spanish came into the Philippines, many of the archbishops or the bishops in particular localities were in fact also entrusted by the kings and the queens of Spain to be in charge of the civil property of the of Spain in Manila, for example. That's why. So That's why the Archdiocese of Manila had come up with all kinds of properties, because precisely they were also entrusted by the king and queen. And for their efforts, they were given, of course, huge properties. There were many problems, but their problems were basically jurisdictional. In other words, who has authority over this particular territory and who does not have. But most of these problems were resolved in Rome. In other words, starting to be centralized. Okay, the bishops are important in their localities, but if there are disputes between bishops, between different territories, who resolves them? You have to go up higher, which is probably the Bishop of Rome. Before, they used to be resolved on the regional levels, and that is why we speak about, nowadays we speak about the bishops' conferences. This is a way of bringing back the whole idea of a regional level kind of supervision or direction or collaboration among different bishops in one particular, let's say, country. But during the time of the 300s to 400s, this was practically the case. But slowly, the centralization was beginning to take place. Most bishops, I think we can thank God for this, were outstanding teachers and leaders. And they were outstanding teachers and leaders because they were mostly chosen from among those who were the educated members of the population who have become Christians. If they were not, of course, from the generation of Christian families, they were actually leaders in their own right, maybe judges or maybe teachers or philosophers in some other professions before they even became a bishop or a priest. So in other words, it is something that was you're looking for a leader, you look for someone who is already there. I think this guy is very good. He's a lawyer. He knows exactly the law. Why don't we just invite him and say, we choose you to become the bishop, so we will ordain you as the bishop. It happens. The deacons gained more power, more than the presbyters, who remained the advisory council of the bishop. The deacons gained more power because they were always beside the bishop. The deacons always entrusted some of the things that he could not do himself to the deacons. So that's why they gained more power. And so the role of the deacon as the assistant of the bishop is very appropriate, because that is really the most classical role of the deacon. Okay, so like for example, in the Eucharistic celebration, the deacon is the one who would read the gospel. The bishop doesn't read the gospel unless he's the only one there. But if there's a deacon, the deacon would read. If there are a concelebrating priest, the concelebrating priest would read, not the bishop, because that is not the role of the presider. The presider doesn't read the reading. The presider presides, but the other people can read. Those who are in the lower hierarchy would be able to read. And the deacons was the most appropriate person to read the gospel. And it continues up to now. The presbyters, now, the presbyters, their function had changed during this time. Before, they were advisors of the bishop, offering counsel, since they were regarded as the elder wise men of the community. That is really the original role of the presbyters. That is why I have told you already that among the Presbyterians, this was something that was emphasized. They have a group of elders, and the elders are the ones who, in a way, govern the particular community, the Christian community. Let's say a Christian community of the Presbyterians, let's say in Metro Manila. They have a group of elders who would be the advisory group. And they are the ones who make decisions on a particular issue. Then, of course, the head of the territory or the diocese is the one who would implement that. But the decision makers are the presbyters. So that is the original idea of presbyters. Now, around this time, it had changed to one with sacramental and pastoral roles in places which the bishop could not reach. Thus, they become the extension of the bishops. I said the deacons normally were the assistant to the bishops. But later on, the deacons there are not enough deacons to do all the work especially when the church was expanding. You needed more people to help out, to help the bishops, and that the bishop can delegate to do his work. So who else would you choose than your council of elders, among the members of the council of elders, your advisors? Maybe you can ask them you come from this particular locality, why don't you be the one to take care of it, take care of this? So that is how it had evolved. So the presbyters now are becoming more the presbyters who are the delegates of the bishop, not only as the leader of the community, but eventually later on as the cultic leader. Okay. So they were seen as priestly figures owing to their liturgical roles, which were delegated to them by the bishop. So the term priest now came to be used in place of the presbyter. When the presbyter, who was a member of the council of elders, started to take the place of the bishop in some of the remote localities, most of the time, the role that he was performing had to do with cultic activities, like the Eucharist, like baptism. So eventually, that was the predominant role that he had played in the Christian community. And that is why now it's closer and closer to the idea of the priest. The priest. So that is how the word priest in our sense, in the Catholic sense, in the Christian sense, had evolved. Okay. So, but the term priest, because it had something to do with the cultic leadership, was used for both bishops and presbyters. So the priests at this point were also the bishops. The bishops are also priests because they were performing cultic leadership. So precisely because of their role as leaders in a liturgical celebration. This is especially true in the writings of St. Jerome, because for him, the priest is either bishop or a presbyter, what used to be a presbyter. Okay. Now, this kind of an arrangement, the growing power of the bishop, both as a spiritual leader and as a liturgical leader and as a civil leader, would have an effect on church ministry. First of all, the change that would take place in the understanding of priesthood. Now, priesthood now has become more and more. It used to be identified with just a ministry. In other words, something functional. This is what you do. You go to the particular barrio and you lead them in prayer, or you visit the sick over there, or you try to find out how you can raise funds to build the chapel, etc. So very ministerial. Okay. Later on, when they were doing all of these things, eventually people, the next generation, people would say, "Oh, my father was a minister. He was one of the council of elders. So why not? What do you call this? Why not do as my father had done? Why not dedicate myself to what my father had done?" Eventually, it's not just a ministry anymore. It's not just a function. It becomes now aspiring towards a state of life. And that is what happened to the priesthood. From a ministerial, functional role to a state of life within the church. So you have now a priest belonging to a particular state of life in distinction to the state of life that the ordinary fulano and fulana would be living. Okay, which are eventually they would be called the lay people. Okay. Now, if this is going to be a state of life, what is the model that we have? They went all the way back to the Old Testament and find out about the life of the priestly class, the Levitical priesthood in the Old Testament. So they belonged to one family. They were the Levitical one tribe. They belonged to the priestly class. And so it became like a state of life. And so when the priesthood became a state of life, they went back to the Old Testament idea of priesthood, the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, Old Testament priesthood, which was identified heavily with cultic functions. Okay, you are the ones who are there in the temple. You are the ones who take care of these liturgical activities. So ordination will be regarded, therefore, as the culmination of election, suitableness, service connected to a particular community. So there has to be a kind of a ritual by which you enter into this state of life. You enter into this ministry, but also to this state of life. Especially if you have a young man who is not married, who would like to dedicate his life to the church, okay, there has to be a kind of a ritual by which this person has been set aside. Okay, set aside. When it's a person that is set aside, it means he is now dedicated to only one particular kind of life. He has been elected by the bishop, he's been chosen by the bishop, of course, and maybe the council of elders, and he's found suitable to do the kind of service for which he would be ordained. And a proof of this is that there are ordination rites. In the 300s, in the 400s, we have ordination rites already in existence. Okay. Yet, they are not yet regarded as so permanent that an ordained priest could not be removed from his position if he were found unfit. Okay, so again, the whole idea of you're a priest is a state of life. But if you do not act properly, the community can say, "Hey, bishop, you better remove this guy because he is not doing what he's supposed to be doing." And in fact, that could be done. And that was done in some instances. So we're not here talking about you're a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. No, that's a different theological justification a little bit later on. Now, so there is still the strong link between the priest and the community he serves, because you are ordained a priest for this particular community. Okay. Now, when we talk about the dioceses now, of course, you're ordained a priest for this particular diocese, which means the bishop can assign you to any part of the diocese because that is still one community, one diocese. So in any part you can be assigned. Not that you can be assigned only in one locality At that time, of course, with the very limited number of Christians, you are in charge of one locality. And that is how they had organized the church at that time. Okay. There were also changes in some aspects of the life of a priest. For example, you are now entering a state of life, which is the priestly class. Therefore, you are more and more in charge of the worship, in charge of the cult. So cultic purity was expected of you. How can you offer a sacrifice when you yourself are not pure, are not worthy of offering that sacrifice? So there is that expectation that you should be pure. You should be at least worthy of what you are doing. Okay. Now, at first, it meant simply abstaining from sexual relations with his wife. So you said the priest at that time had wife, and even some bishops had wife, and sometimes more than just one wife. Sometimes they had two wives. Okay. So what was expected of them at the beginning was, okay, no sexual relations before you offer a sacrifice. Okay? Can you sacrifice that much? Okay, okay. If you can, then okay, we will accept you. So, or if you have two wives, can you only do with one particular month, for example? In other words, be a little bit more discreet about your own relationship. We need to understand that that was the case in the early church. Okay. Now, again, this was heavily influenced by the Old Testament regulations on temple priests. Again, many people who associate priests or people with the temple expect something different. They expect something, oh, wow, si Father, ganito, ganyan, ganyan. Okay. Now, but also the influence was coming from a Neoplatonic philosophy, which basically looked at sexual or carnal activity as opposite to the life of the spirit. This was very strong in Augustine, for example. And Augustine was basically Neoplatonist in his philosophy, in his philosophical background. Anything that has to do with sexual, with the flesh, is opposite to the spirit. Okay, so it is the flesh that weighs down, that pulls down the spirit. Instead of soaring into the heavenly realm in the contemplative beatific vision, in the contemplation of the beatific vision, it's the flesh that is weighing it down. Now, this is still very much the mentality of many, many people today. Not only among priests, but also among people, like people, among sisters also. Okay. The priest is a spiritual man who should be above all these carnal desires or sexual activity. Okay. By the way, this was the origin of the law of priestly celibacy. But the celibacy will not be, what do you call this, enforced until maybe 6, 7, 800 years later. Okay, so this was still going on up to even the Middle Ages. So we could have some priests who still had some wives during this time. Of course, the ideal priest is the one who does not have a wife. Okay. Now, there was also a shift from the house church to the basilical church, from a small familial gathering to large congregational assembly. You have there in the background a picture of what was called a basilical structure, a big rectangular structure, which was basically used by the Roman Empire or the people of the Roman Empire for gatherings, for community gatherings, rectangular. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire, places like this, the basilical congregational areas, have been transformed into the gathering place for the Eucharistic assembly. That is how the basilical structure of the church got started. A big church, usually rectangular, a big church, and at the very far end would be the place of leadership, the prominent. So There was also a change in the perspectives on pastoral duties. Okay, before it was involving visit of community members, attending to their daily needs, but more and more, because there was a much more greater demand, it was reduced to cultic functions, eventually far or apart from the community. The function of a priestly class. It's like the function of the Old Testament priest. He would go to the altar near the Ark of the Covenant and do and perform his priestly duties without even seen by the people. Not even seen by the people. And that is still what is happening in some Orthodox churches. The sanctuary is not seen by the people. The people stay outside of the sanctuary. The priest goes inside because he's the only one who is allowed to go inside the sanctuary. And while he's there in the sanctuary, he does the prayers. Okay, very much like the Old Testament idea of the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. Priesthood then came to be regarded as consecrated ministry. And that is why we say sacerdotalis. Sacer is making sacred. Sacerdotalis, making sacred or consecrating. So now, as a sacerdos, a priest is someone who is made sacred, who has been consecrated. Consecrated is from the word consacrare, which is to make holy. Okay, so or sacerdotalis is the status of life of someone who has been set aside. So it became a style of life, from the style of life to a state of life. Style of life, functionary, ministerial, to a state of life, I now belong to the priestly class. And you cannot touch me. I am above you. Okay. This eventually meant, of course, that priesthood was much higher, a much higher state of life than the ordinary laymen, laywomen, or even sisters and other people. They are one class higher. Higher than what? Higher than the lay people, of course. So this was the sacerdotalization of ministry or clericalization of ministry. So that's as far as the ministry becoming more priestly. Ministry now has been regarded more as, particularly as more a cultic responsibility, but cultic in the sense of the priesthood idea. Now, this next era is what we call the era of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Middle Ages. It, of course, would consist of what we would call the rebuilding of the West from 400 to 700, to the rise of Western Christendom from 800 to about 1000 or a little bit later. Okay, so again, what is the context, historical context? There was a barbarian invasion in 451. Now, history books always characterize this as basically the fall of the Roman Empire. Probably it fell, but according to Gibbons, who wrote a great book on the fall of the Roman Empire, according to him, the Roman Empire fell from within, not from without, not because of the attacks of people like the barbarians coming from the north. No. The barbarians coming from the north were like migrations going into Rome. But even before the barbarians, what we call barbarians, or the tribes from the north would come to Rome, would sack, in fact, Rome was already decaying. Rome was already beginning to disintegrate, not only as a kingdom, but because of its, all the sins of, when you become so self-sufficient, you become so powerful, eventually there's no other way for you than down. It happened with all empires, and it will happen with all coming empires. So Americans are fearful that the American empire is now going down and down and down. And with leader like Trump, of course, there is no doubt it's going to come down. Okay, but now China is going to come up as the new empire. But we need to remember that China was already an empire long before. Even some people say, even during the time of Jesus Christ, China was already an empire. The only thing is we did not study the history of China at that time. It became already an empire, big empire. Of course, Persia was an empire. Greece was an empire because of Alexander, and of course, the Roman Empire. But all of these empires just fell. Look at the Persians, look at the Egyptians, look at the Greeks, look at the Romans. And then later on, of course, you would find, look at the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. So the Barbarian Invasion, the Western Empire disintegrated and was gradually reorganized. And we need to admit that the reason for the great factor in the reorganization of the empire was because of the church. Because of the church. Because of the population that considered himself as Christian. So as what we would call a civil society, the Roman Empire fell apart. Okay. But because the Roman Empire was associated with the church, so the church also fell apart, mostly because there were not enough good leaders during this time. But when there were good leaders on the part of the church, they were the ones who actually gave an impulse to the reorganization and rebuilding of the Roman Empire. So Rome became more important as the empires and the Western churches' capital. Okay. Rome was, of course, the capital of the Roman Empire. When it fell, of course, then the Roman Empire part of it went to to Constantinople, present day, what do you call this? Istanbul, okay, Turkey, which eventually would be called Byzantium. Okay, so the Byzantine Empire, that was also the Byzantine Empire, or which was also the predecessor of the Ottoman Empire in the 1700s and 1800s. Okay, now, so Rome became more and more important, not only as the civil empire's capital, but also the empire of the church, the capital of the church. So greater centralization now of authority, especially when you have a great pope like Gregory the Great, who was both in pastoral works for the victims of the invasion, as well as a reformer within the church. When you speak about the Gregorian chant, he is the one who started this thing. We talk about the Gregorian reform in terms of the liturgy, he was in the head of it. He was a great pope, a very, very good pope. And he served both the church and the empire. Of course, he was so great that all the other Roman emperors could not hold a candle against him. He was just outstanding. But there were 5 sees, or what we call patriarchal sees, patriarchates, that remain influential. And this is, again, owing to the great tradition in the very early years of Christianity, meaning Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. They are the patriarchates that until now are considered patriarchates in the church, the universal church. So the Pope is the Patriarch of Rome. There's a Patriarch of Constantinople in Istanbul. There's a Patriarch in Antioch. By the way, the Patriarch in Constantinople and the Patriarch of Greece are Orthodox. They're Orthodox. The Patriarch of Antioch is north of the capital of north of Syria. It's in Syria. Constantinople is in present-day Turkey. Antioch is in present-day Syria. Alexandria is in present-day Egypt. And of course, Jerusalem is in present-day Israel. Okay, these are until now considered as the patriarchates, and the patriarchs are just on the same level as the Pope. But of course, in the Western Church, we recognize the Pope as the head or the first among equals. So when we talk about processions, the patriarchs normally would go right before the Pope. The cardinals would go a little bit. There was a big to do about this in the Second Vatican Council, because one of the patriarchs was in a way demoted by the Vatican liturgists into a lower rank than the cardinal, which is not the case. Now, there was a big emperor in 325 who was Constantine, but in 800 or 700s, there was also another great emperor, but he was now the emperor of the renovated or the reborn empire, which is now called the Holy Roman Empire, because association between the church and the secular empire was very, very close. And Charlemagne was considered the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, why was he called Charlemagne? Charlemagne means Charles the Great. Why was he considered Charles the Great? Because he was really big. He was almost a 7-footer. He was really huge person. Until now, if you go to Aachen is the place where Father Kenneth finished his doctorate in philosophy. Aachen is the old capital of the Holy Roman Emperor, the seat of Charlemagne. There is there the breastplate, the armor of Charlemagne, which is really an armor fit for a 7-footer, a big person. That's why he was called the great emperor. But he also introduced a lot of things in the reform of the Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire transferred from the Franks, basically the French, Pepin and company. Constantinople came from the line of Pepin, to the Germans, and the title now became Holy Roman Emperor. Okay. Now, during this time, the rebirth of Christianity and the rebirth of the Roman Empire, there was mission and evangelization, and they were mostly undertaken by monks who were coming from monasteries and the diocesan schools. They were the learned ones because the monks studied. They were studying. So when Gregory the Great, for example, needed some missionaries to go to these different areas, at that time inhabited by so-called barbarians, he had chosen people from the monasteries, the abbots or the learned people in the monasteries, to be the missionaries, let's say, into the north, like Germany, or into England, into Ireland. He would send these great missionaries who were basically monks. So their lifestyle was basically the lifestyle of a monk. So what they had transported to the northern part of Europe was basically monastic spirituality. Okay. Eventually, of course, they developed into the colleges and eventually the universities of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. At this time, of course, the rise of Western Christendom was also the time for feudalism. You have again in the background the feudal triangle, the new social and political order revolving around land ownership and agriculture. The overall head is the king. Under the king are lords, members of the nobility. Then under the members of the nobility are people who are workers for them, the tenants, so to speak. And then, of course, under the tenants were what we would call the workers, the slaves, the ones who do most of the work. And they were, of course, the majority. Now, this kind of feudal organizational structure societal structure came to be reflected also in the church. So the hierarchical society, the structure of society included also the bishops and clergy who owed allegiance ultimately to the princes. So the bishops and the clergy would go like the second rank among the nobilities. That is why later on, in the time of the French Revolution, the clergy was always identified with the nobility. And that is why the French revolutionaries also attacked the clergy, because they were considered as members of the nobility. Okay, so patronage was on a different levels. There were two. The Pope and the Frankish and Germanic kings were considered the patrons. Of course, they had properties and properties and properties all over. So if you would like to work in one particular place, you have to secure the authorization and the blessing of the bishop, or by the Pope, or by the king. Okay. But there was also another kind of patronage, a more spiritual kind of patronage. And that was provided by the saints. And for this particular type of patronage, they begin to establish what we would call the shrines, different places dedicated or in the name of a particular famous bishop, saintly monk. They started to be erected in a particular place. And people came to these places to give tribute or respect, of course, to the saintly person who lived there. But eventually, of course, this became the beginning of the not only what we would call the shrines, but also the relics. You talk about the relics because the relics remind you of the outstanding example, the idealism that had been provided to us by the great saints. So, in a way, this was a spiritual patronage. The material or the secular patronage would be on the level of what the Pope or the king or the bishops and the nobles can do for you. Now, so there was this union of church and state. From 500 CE on, the power of the church was closely identified with that of the state or the empire. You will remember that the empire, of course, because of the fall of Rome, eventually get smaller and smaller and smaller. But what was maintained pretty much was the church structure, where the Pope was strong, the bishops were strong. Okay, but emperors felt it was their duty to protect the church. Eventually, when of course they were restored, and to push forward imperial as well as ecclesial programs. So again, this is what we would call the rulers who are very Christian, because they really took care of the church. And of course, they took care of the church because the church also took care of them. This union became even more pronounced when sons of noble families were chosen as church leaders. Aha! Before we say the council, who would succeed the bishop? Well, from members of the council of elders. Okay, so they would become the next bishop. But when the bishop became strong, when the popes became strong, and they had relatives, and they belonged to the higher class because they were educated, they were the intellectual class, they belonged to the upper elite in the population, and if their sons would become the church leaders, then of course they have ensured the marriage between the union and state. I mean, the union between church and state. Okay, so it is not altogether what do you call this, inconceivable that the bishop, maybe some of the bishops had their own children, because remember some of them had wives. Maybe they had their own children. It was not altogether inconceivable that the bishop would appoint one of his sons to become his successor, or one of the children of the kings to be considered as a possible successor in this particular diocese. Not altogether inconceivable. Because who else would you appoint? Would you appoint somebody who is not educated? He could be chosen by the people, but he's not educated. And he doesn't have the rank of the nobility. So when you come time to, to exercising your power, this person who does not belong to the nobility would feel inferior to the others who do have, even if they are not clerics, but they are superior. So in order to counteract that, the best thing to do is you ordain some of your members of your family to become this or to become that, to become a bishop or to become a cardinal sometimes. And eventually some of those families, royal families, would compete among themselves in trying to suggest or to nominate one of their sons to become pope. And that will eventually come in the 1500s. That is going to be the battle in Italy, in Rome. Different families would be what do you call this, exercising political power or political maneuvering in order to have one of their sons elected as a cardinal and eventually as a pope. So this is none other than power politics. And the power politics in this sense would make the church be more centered on the people who hold the highest power, which means the Pope and the bishops. So the most important people now in the church became the popes and the bishops. Who was set aside? The community. The community now are going to be serving the Pope and the bishops. And if they also happen to be also civil, rulers, then all of those slaves of the civil ruler will have to work for this person. Okay? So ministries will be according to this setup. So that is how the church had changed in the Middle Ages. But there was one group that where the church